At a time when crime is affecting so many Canadians, it's little wonder that it's the topic of conversation at every dinner table. Hello, I'm Adrienne Batra. With me are Warren Kinsella and Brian Lilley. Warren, I live in a big city that has the trappings of all the things that happen, including crime. We're seeing it on our subway system. People are worried to go out for walks. It's touching every aspect of our lives. We see big city chiefs of police. We saw the premiers write about bail reform. We need to focus on changing the system and making it harder for criminals. So we see a Supreme Court ruling today, but I want to talk a little bit about the issue of crime in this country.
Yeah, so you've editorialized on it. Brian and I have written about it. The political consequence of the surging crime and the concern about crime, Pierre Poilievre's winning. Like if an election were held today, Pierre Poilievre would win it because he's talking about law and order, he's talking about justice, he's talking about crime, and he's emotionally in sync with what a majority of Canadians feel, including Canadians of a progressive variety and women too. This is a way in for him to crack into female voters, I believe. Why Trudeau is not speaking about it mystifies me. There have been past Liberal prime ministers who have, and at least are able to turn it into a wash politically. Why Trudeau is not, I find completely bizarre. And I think right now the political reality is Poilievre's winning in large part because he's talking about crime, which is, as you say, an issue that's being discussed at every dinner table.
Brian, the Toronto Sun, we cover it cover to cover, and it's becoming, on our newsroom meetings, it's the number one issue that keeps coming up, crime. I mentioned the TTC. You've been writing about that. You've been writing about the randomness and the random acts of violence that are taking place all over this country. That's the part that really scares people. But there's one consistency: whenever there's a perpetrator that has been caught, we find out they're on bail. And so there has been this push for reform for bail. It's come from the premiers, they've already written. It's come from the chiefs of police. Do you see any movement on that from the federal government?
Other than saying we'll talk, we'll think about it, no. But David Lametti, the justice minister, has been saying he'll think about it for a while. Lametti is an academic. That's his background. He comes at this from a very theoretical point of view. He did not bring in the 2019 bail reform that said bail needs to be the default position, that getting perpetrators, suspects, alleged criminals out the door as quickly as possible with as few conditions as possible. The 2019 bail reforms made that the de facto standard that judges and justices of the peace have to follow. Now, this was, as I said, that was an academic exercise that was adopted in many places. But New York State, under a progressive Democrat governor, they're facing the same problems. And they're saying, you know what, we need to back up. Because when you look at whether it's Toronto and the crimes happening not just on the TTC, but everywhere, whether you look at Ottawa, Calgary, across British Columbia, the big city mayors in British Columbia did a survey, and they looked at everywhere from Kelowna, Penticton, Vancouver, Victoria. It's a small number of repeat offenders causing the most problems. In Kelowna, it was 15 people with more than 1,000 negative police interactions. That is a remarkable stat, but you talk to everybody and it's the same thing. It's why time and again, when we hear somebody's released, they have a failure to comply with bail conditions as one of the charges they face.
So, Warren, just to the politics of this, we've touched on it a little bit, but why won't the Trudeau Liberals look at this? They barely even acknowledged the premiers across the country, who are rarely unified on anything, but certainly on this. Why won't they acknowledge it? Why won't they even discuss it?
I think they're politically tone deaf on it. You look at, to cite that example Brian just did, New York State, New York City. It is a Democratic Party fortress. And Eric Adams, who's the new mayor of New York City, and I've got a column about this in our paper, has said, enough is enough. He's a Democrat. And he's saying, in the case of some of the other sources of trouble and crime, and we all know it's taking place involving people who are homeless, people who are under-medicated, or over-medicated or profoundly mentally ill have been dumped on the streets. And, some of these crimes we've now seen are being committed by these people. Adams is saying enough is enough. He's got the support of some in the psychiatric community saying, we need to get back to what we were, where if we have to ensure and use, some persuasion to get people the treatment they need, we need to do that. That's something that the Trudeau guys can and should be saying. But again, they've just let go the entire law and order message to Poilievre. And like right now, as you pointed out off the top, that's a big, big mistake, because along with cost of living, this is the issue that Canadians are talking about.
So let's just shift then, Brian, to the Supreme Court of Canada ruling that just came out on the issue of crime and punishment. A Harper-era decision that came forward was to have mandatory minimums. The Liberals threw that out, but the Supreme Court had something to say about that recently.
Yeah. So in one case, they said that mandatory minimums are not cruel and unusual punishment, that they're constitutional. That involved, one of the cases in that was an armed robbery, and the person who was convicted there said, "Oh no, this is cruel and unusual punishment." The Supreme Court said no. But in another case, and this is puzzling, we need to dive deeper into the decision and the reasonings. They said that it was cruel and unusual punishment. And in this case, it was a guy who was stoned out of his tree, drunk off of his butt, had a high-powered hunting rifle. This is bigger than deer rifle. And he's got a baseball bat and a big gun, and he's walking down the street shooting at cars. He shot into a house with a couple and their 2 children, and he faced a mandatory minimum of 4 years. The sentencing judge said, well, no, that's cruel and unusual punishment. I don't know how, but the way they got to it was they said, hypothetically, a teenager could shoot a BB gun at a house, and then they hypothetically could go to jail for 4 years. And so they struck it down. The appeals court called that ridiculous, sent it to the Supremes, and the Supremes agreed and said using this hypothetical scenario is still valid. I think most Canadians would be shocked that that's how they came up with this. Instead of looking at the case before them, they looked at the case they wanted to find to get to the verdict they wanted. That's out of sync with where I think Canadians are, with somebody shooting up a car, with somebody driving down the street in it, and shooting up a house moments later with people inside it.
Warren, I find it interesting. Canadians probably follow the U.S. Supreme Court more than they know what's actually going on in our own Canadian Supreme Court, and the consequences and the decisions that are being made there, and the impact that has on and on our lives. This ruling, from your perspective, what's the impact, political or not? Last word to you.
Well, I think that, full disclosure, the Supreme Court Justice who wrote the opinion for the majority is Sheila Martin, who taught me contracts when I was in law school, and I got a lousy mark from her. She's pretty tough. She's got a feminist orientation, but she's super smart. And I found it quite interesting that she preserved, at least in some part, the notion of mandatory minimums that is popular politically. And I think there's a lot of people, on the bench and in law who feel that it is appropriate. Why is it appropriate? It's the legislature, which is supreme, giving guidance to judges, saying, we as a society express disapproval of this type of crime, and this is the minimum charge, penalty that should be applied there. The Trudeau guys have gotten rid of that. And that gets back to the thing we've been talking about for the past few minutes and that you mentioned off the top. The Trudeau guys are just out of sync with public opinion on this critical issue. And, if they don't get their act together, they're looking at losing the next election.
Well, Canadians have an expectation at the minimum that their government will keep them safe. Log on to Facebook and Twitter, let us know what you think, and go to thetorontosun.com for more on stories like this and coverage you will not find anywhere else.